To explain a more fantastic possibility, we have to go into a little more detail. Independent research leads us to some anomalies in the historical record that has echoes of supposedly new technology being utilized before it was claimed to have been invented. When looking into the provenance of these Tartarian structures, a phenomenon strangely familiar to many people today manifests itself, namely AI, artificial intelligence, authored narratives. Services like ChatGPT are used for various reasons, such as cheats for students compiling reports, where you offer a few snippets of information and the AI will generate a seemingly original essay, padded out using those few details. This bears a striking similarity with the historical narratives available online, and presumably at libraries, where certain characteristics of AI scripts are found. For instance, when searching through details of a particular building, we'll find multiple related references, where someone credited with designing the structure will have the Christian name Charles, for example, and then throughout the passage there'll be references to Charles Street, and then someone else with the surname Charles. Whereas this anomaly may manifest itself on rare occasions, it's unreasonable to expect it to reoccur multiple times. If we acknowledge that a previous culture seemingly had technology so advanced that we can't explain it officially today, then it's a reasonable assumption to make that the technology we're familiar with today lags behind theirs, or to put it another way, that technology is being withheld from us and released in stages by a section of people at the top. In other words, this technology has been usurped by those who inherited it, and are controlling societies worldwide who mistakenly believe they are advancing technologically by means of a natural progression of knowledge. Remember that this hypothesis isn't a fanciful science fiction fantasy, but rather a logical interpretation of evidence-based research, and it allows for some sobering consequences. One baffling part of the historical timeline, as was previously referred to, is the seemingly illogical gap in technological advancement, where our official history is peopled with thousands of characters and events, all existing in apparent poverty and basic technology. So in other words, whether it's Oliver Cromwell or Napoleon, they traveled around in horse and carts and read by candlelight in their basic dwellings. Yet the Tartarian evidence seems to show that at the time of Napoleon there should have been amazing transport and more. They can't both be right. How then does the official historical timeline's collection of artifacts, littered with coinage, books, paintings, official documents and relics etc., overwhelmingly validate the horse and cart narrative with all of these characters and events in the post-Roman era, and even during it? In reality, quite easily. Imagine we wanted to write a historical play for school children. The first thing we'd do is create whatever story we desire that the children can reasonably act out, with characters, storyline and dialogue. We now have to provide costumes, scenery, props and all we'd need to make the play more believable. We can even tell the children that all of these props and costumes are genuinely from the time periods they are acting out. After all, they are just children, right? This may seem like a fanciful possibility at first, but if every adult controlling the performance sticks to their story, then why wouldn't the children believe it? Essentially, I'm going to suggest that this is exactly the situation we find ourselves in as naive followers of the official narrative. To reinforce this point, a series of photographs have come to light from the mid-19th century of several major cities. The shadows show that the time is typically around early afternoon, and although the views are expansive, in some cases showing almost the entire city from their vantage point, there isn't a single living thing to be seen. It has the eerie feel of a stage set, waiting for the actors to step onto it. If we imagine a future derivative of AI, then we can easily imagine concocting the most elaborate of scripts with a cast of thousands, all created synthetically. This script has kings, inventors, playwrights, sportsmen, their children, friends, anything we like, and AI will accommodate it. Now we have to provide the props, and this is where it gets interesting. As an example, let's take coinage. We could say, of course, there was an Edward II, here's a coin with his head on it, but how was this coin brought into the public arena? The same story goes for books, paintings, documents, etc. But again, let's ask where they came from. Only the most naive of us would believe that controlling institutions are independent of control, whether it be a research establishment, university or government, and that ultimately nothing gets to be seen by us that those pulling the strings don't want seen. Conversely, we'll be shown anything they want us to see, all due to the placement of controlled assets within the system. Ask yourself why it is that in the last 100 years, with millions of building contractors digging up the ground, they've never found a dinosaur relic, yet obscure archaeological digs miraculously unearth groundbreaking, pardon the pun, discoveries that change the whole narrative of the natural world. When construction companies do unearth archaeological marvels, there's an instant control set in place by these same institutions, and this is where we gain a brief insight into the previous civilizations hidden from us, before they are closed off to the public. Let's go back to the coinage though. Firstly, are these coins forensically tested, and if they are, who tests them, and ultimately verifies their provenance? We could say the same with documents. After all, a seemingly ancient archive or relic won't be tested destructively to ascertain its age, and similarly items of clothing etc. are kept under lock and key or behind glass cases out of reach or scrutiny. Maybe a curious curator would start asking questions, possibly urging their supervisors to do a forensic analysis. But how far do you think they'd get if the senior official decides against it? How are these relics found? Let's suppose someone buys an old house and finds an old newspaper or other document. Are you seriously telling me that a worldwide controlling force with unlimited funds and resources couldn't have these items placed and apparently unearthed by members of the public? If you believe that forensic processes like carbon dating are foolproof, then ask yourself who devised them. Remember that most of our supposed heritage is supported by documents in heavily guarded and controlled institutions like the British Library or Westminster Abbey. Not only do these controlling forces have unlimited funds and resources, but they've had probably 200 years and counting to implement their placements and control. I haven't just plucked this figure of 200 years out of thin air, there's a reason I used it. If we assume that, say, the last 50 years of history couldn't be manipulated so easily, because we'd have parents or others who could corroborate the truth, then how far back could we reasonably rely on? Well, let's say for instance that somewhere in a library or on a heritage website somewhere there's a narrative for a structure that was built in your town in the early 60s. Now there are a number of factors at play here. One is the fairly primitive record, where up until about 20 years ago the only way of accessing this information would have been to sit at a library monitor and scan those slides, or wade through documents. And more significantly, you'd be looking specifically for this item for a reason. How many times do you seriously think this would happen before the last 5 years or so when we've started to become suspicious? Now let's say the item tells us that the structure was built in 1962, how could we verify it? We could see photographs where the structure is encased in scaffolding, or even partially constructed. Is this proof? Well, let's examine some curious evidence discovered by several contemporary independent researchers. For those of you familiar with graphics software such as Photoshop, this might be easier to understand, but I'll try and explain the origins of the original techniques it mimics. If we wanted to create an image of you standing on the moon playing golf with Bob Hope, this is what we'd do. First of all, we need an image of you with a golf club, click, then we need a picture of Bob Hope, and finally a lunar landscape. We lay out the lunar landscape as a background, and then we take a modeling knife and delicately cut out you and then Bob. Now we need to match the sizes, and this is done with an enlarger, which is basically a way of either bringing a camera closer to the required image or pulling it away depending on whether we want it smaller or larger. Once we've retaken photographs of the images at the appropriate sizes, we simply paste them in layers on top of each other like a collage and take a photograph of the final result. Click. An extremely difficult part of this process, even with modern software, is the precision in cutting around the individual images, more often than not leaving a telltale border or ragged trace of inaccuracy. Now in the example of the lunar landscape we'd likely have a black sky to lay the cutouts of you and Bob against, but if we wanted to remove something from the skyline, then we'd also have to cut out that background so that it wasn't in the final image. Shockingly, we see in several historical images evidence of where the knife has left traces of those cutouts when we zoom in. Why would so many images have had this process applied to them? The majority of images don't need photographic trickery anyway. All you do is surround the completed structure with scaffolding and say that it's a construction image, but removing a dome or hiding something in the background would require more cut and pasted images. Suspicious. Those of us researching online have found that over the last 5 years or so that information we search for online changes regularly, highlighting this ongoing rewriting of history, his story. Two questions that arise are firstly, how could they get away with it? Secondly, why? The fact is that they're not getting away with it, we're starting to see their mistakes. Remember that apart from their control technology that we simply don't understand, there's the fact that we've been kept in a controlled situation where we wouldn't have a reason to even suspect anything anyway. The reasons they do it are the crux of the matter. That takes us back to the pseudo-psychopathic mindset of those perpetrating it. It's about control. A normal, well-adjusted person would have basic needs and aspirations, such as feeding your children and indulging the creative aspects we feel as a consequence of being human. The mindset of those who aren't human, however, holds an entirely different agenda, and they must protect their manufactured lie to support their narrative. If we reflect on our official timeline compared with logic, we find that throughout thousands of years where impossible architecture was created, all of these people had simple horse and cart, candlelight technology. Then in the 19th century, bang, there's an explosion of embryonic technology. We have steam power, followed by the internal combustion engine, photography, the telegraph, the list goes on. So let us look at the 19th century and start to unravel what the truth could look like. The photographic evidence, apart from the multitude of doctored images, includes images of these impossible palaces, claimed to have been built in the 19th century, with their lower stories buried in mud. In other words, the ground level is raised, in some cases to the second or third story, and subsequent excavations have uncovered structures that have several stories beneath the surface level. This phenomenon is spread across the entire world, yet nothing in our official history makes even a reference to it. This phenomenon is known by independent researchers as the mud flood event.